Hello, fellow rebel capitalists. Hope you're well. Lumber prices are soaring once again. Let's dive into this CNBC article and check it out. The headline: Soaring lumber price adds nearly $19,000 to the cost of a new home. After falling back sharply from a record high in May of last year, lumber prices began climbing again in December. They're now about 22% lower than at the peak, but still three times their average pre pandemic price, according to Random Lengths. The National Association of Home Builders estimated the recent price jump added more than 18.6 to a thousand to the price of a newly built home. I'm assuming they're just using probably 2,500 square feet. There's kind of a ballpark average, would be my guess. So after falling sharply, so prices went way, way up, and they came crashing down. But now they have gone back up to a point where they're still lower than at their highs, but they're far, far higher than they were on an average prior to the cerveza sickness. That is adding the cost to new home. We talked about that. It also added nearly $7,300 to the cost of an average new multifamily home. I would assume that means an apartment, which translates into households paying $67 a month more to rent a new apartment. I think they're paying a heck of a lot more than that. But I would confirm that this number is accurate, if not understates. As you guys know, I'm good friends with Kenny McElroy, and we're partners along with Jason Hartman in our mastermind group. And most of the members of our mastermind group are big time real estate developers. And they're in multifamily just like Kenny. And I've heard from all of them the exact same thing, that the price to build new, even apartment grade, has gone up significantly per door. So they say there's several reasons behind the inflation, but it's mostly that sawmills can't keep up with the demand. Sawmill output dropped at the start of the pandemic and will, while it has recovered some, still plagued by labor shortages. Well, see, okay, so now let's start dissecting the nuance here so we can try to figure out what may happen throughout the rest of 2022 as far as the housing market or inflation in general, as measured by the government, called the CPI, just as a proxy. So, what happens if the Fed starts raising rates in March? I mean, now the market is saying that they're going to raise seven times. Seven times. I don't think they'll get there, but maybe they will. But if they are, if they do raise even three or four times and start QT, I don't know how the market goes higher as a result, if or unless the government comes out into another massive round of deficit spending. Call it CARES Act 2.0. How are they going to justify it? Unless we have some sort of black swan event? I don't know. Especially, how are they going to justify that in their own minds with the CPI, headline CPI at 7.5%? Like I've said many times on this channel, I think that inflation is right at the top of the food chain as far as political kryptonite. And the politicians know it. So if they come out and say, "Oh my gosh, well, we need to spend another 5 trillion to give people more money so they can buy stocks," they know darn well that that will most likely increase inflation, therefore decrease the odds of them being reelected. And I always say there are no certainties, there are only probabilities. But the one thing that we can say with almost 100% certainty is that the politicians' number one priority is just themselves, power, control, authority, and they cannot exercise or gain power and control if they are not in office. Therefore, their number one priority is getting reelected. That's what I'm saying here. So I don't know, how the market stays at this level or continues to trend higher if the Fed is actually raising interest rates and doing quantitative tightening. Also, too, you've got to remember your argument is the government's going to come out and spend a lot of money. How does that work if the Fed's not doing QE? They're going to just issue $5 trillion in treasuries, and that's going to be just absorbed by the market. Maybe, maybe not. Now, I'm not saying that interest rates would spike up to 10% or something, but I think that there's a strong argument for them at least going up 1%. Now, I'm talking about the 10-year. And I'd like to reference back to a fantastic blog post from my good friends Jeff Snyder and Emil Kalinowski, where they talk about a study from the Fed where they said that according to their measurements, quantitative easing dropped the long end of the curve, we'll say the 10-year, by maybe 15 basis points. I think they said the max was 150. But let's just assume that they're correct, and that if they stop doing quantitative easing and do quantitative tightening, that will add another 1 or maybe 1.5% to the 10-year as it is right now. And it goes up to 3.5%. Okay, what does that do to stock prices? What does that do to home prices, for heaven's sakes? You see, so we've got all of these fascinating cross currents where I would argue that we have a massive supply shortage at the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to housing stock. What I'm talking about are these starter homes. You try to find a home being built for under 250 grand. It ain't going to happen because the builders can't make a profit. And we see that their input costs are soaring or continuing to soar. Now, I do think that the supply chains will get fixed to some degree, but they're broken. The government can't come in and just destroy the entire economy. And then we just assume that they can just flip a light switch and the economy comes right back to what it was in 2019. Or we just flip a light switch and the supply chains go right back to where they were in 2019. No, no. You created a massive amount of economic distortions. Talk about the central planners. And it's going to take a long, long time to fix those and bring them back up to 100%. But if the central planners, let's say, brought these supply chains down to 50% capacity, I'm not saying they'll go back up to 100, but maybe they'll go back up to 60 or 70, something like that, where we do see a little bit more supply come online that would help soften prices. But still, the supply and the demand side is going to be there, or the problem of the supply and the demand is going to be there, at least at the low end. I don't see how that gets resolved. But we have another cross current of if rates go up to, let's say, 3.5%, well, then what does that do to affordability? Well, that definitely decreases affordability. So we have demand going down, while at the same time we have a supply chain or we have a supply issue. So how does that play out in prices? Do we have just a stalemate? Do they flatline? There's a lot to think about right here, and that's why I'm trying to bring this to your attention. Also, we've talked about the yield curve flattening. Well, if the result of QT is that rates on the 10-year go up to 3.5%, well, then there's probably not going to be an inversion in the yield curve. And if there's not an inversion in the yield curve, there most likely won't be a recession. So that's just another cross current that you've got to think through. Now, I believe that QE or QT won't necessarily increase interest rates that much. I would be more closer to the 15 basis point move than the 150 basis point move. And therefore, I'm more in the camp that the highest probable outcome is that the yield curve will continue to flatten, if not invert, if, and this is a big if, the Fed continues to raise rates and raises rates 7 times in 2022. So I think the main takeaway for people who are interested in housing is, or buying a house, is you got to realize you're playing with fire. That housing prices are at all-time highs. There is a supply constraint to a certain degree. but there may be a decrease in demand. Therefore, if I was considering buying a house right now, the only house I would consider buying in the United States would be a starter home, because I know that at least for the immediate future, the builders can't produce any more of them at a profit. Therefore, the supply that you do see coming online is most likely at the high end. And one other chart that I want to point out to illustrate what I'm saying, or to give you a better idea of what's going on. We all say, supply issues. There's supply issues, supply issues. Yes, but I think that's being overstated to a certain degree in the media. This is why. Here's a chart of new private owned housing units started in the United States. Now, right now, we are at uh, this is thousands of units. So I believe this would be a million, right around 1,074,000. If I'm thinking through that correctly. So we've got a million, roughly, we're trending at about a million starts. And that's about average. So now you could say, George, well, the population has increased dramatically. Yeah, I think there's an argument there. So I don't think this is adjusted for population. It's not housing starts per person or per 100,000 people. So I think there is a good argument there that supply is low relative to population. But I mean, look at what it's done. I mean, we had the population grow throughout this entire chart, and still it seems like the average kind of stays consistent, because maybe the increase in supply is kind of growing with the level of population over the long term. Obviously, there's dramatic swings up and down. But the point here is that we're at about a historic norm as far as new private owned housing unit starts. So I think the issue might be a little bit more on the demand side as far as why you're seeing prices go up to such a staggering degree, or maybe on the side of people just aren't selling their home. Maybe there's a lot fewer people. Maybe the turnover of homes isn't as great. So when people have more money to spend, because you guys know the stimmy checks, the PPP, we've gone over that. You know, eh, eh, we've gone over that 1,000 times here on this channel, so you guys get it. So maybe the demand side of the equation is what we should be looking at a little bit more than the supply side of the equation, if we're trying to figure out what nominal prices will do in 2022. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Always remember to stand up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism, and I will see you on the next video. One thing I want to point out, that I'm going to be doing a live stream at noon Eastern time today with at Macro Alf. If you watched the Rebel Capitalist show interview last night on the George Gammon channel, I'm sure that our good friend Alf, who was referred to me by Lynn Alden, completely blew your mind. So we're going to get him on today to answer your questions live at noon Eastern. So we'll see you soon, guys, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.